I didn't hate my job, though I probably should have. It was beige in every sense of the word. Beige walls, beige cubicles, beige coffee. I spent most days drowning in spreadsheets and buried under deadlines that no one seemed to care about until 5 minutes before they were due. But I stayed. I didn't even look for other jobs. And the reason was simple. Mark. He was my manager. Maybe 10 years older than me, with salt just beginning to touch the edges of his dark hair and a voice that could settle a room without trying. There was nothing flashy about him, no tailored suits or power games, but he had this quiet gravity, like someone who knew exactly who he was and didn't need to prove it. He remembered people's birthdays. He brought real cream for the break room fridge. And he always looked you in the eye when you spoke, like he actually cared what you had to say. It was that last part that got to me the most. In a place full of people who just wanted to clock in and disappear, Mark noticed things. He noticed me, not in any big, dramatic way, but in the way he'd ask if I was doing okay after a rough meeting, or the way his brow would furrow slightly when he saw me rubbing my temple after too many hours staring at the screen. He wasn't intrusive, just there. And I, in turn, became painfully aware of every little detail about him. I knew how he rolled up his sleeves when he was focused, how he bit the inside of his cheek when he was reading something complicated. I knew his laugh. Not loud, but warm and genuine, the kind that made your chest loosen. I knew that he liked cinnamon in his coffee and hated when people left dirty mugs in the sink. I even knew which pen was his favorite, because he always clicked it 3 times before signing anything. My crush on him wasn't sudden. It grew in quiet moments. The brush of his hand as he passed me a file, the way he'd lean over my desk to explain something, close enough that I could smell the clean, subtle scent of his cologne. I never let it show, of course. Not at work. I kept everything locked up tight. Smiles that didn't linger, glances that didn't drift. But inside was a different story. Some days, the pull of it made my chest ache. I wasn't naive. I knew there was a line, and I knew exactly where it was drawn. He was my boss. I was an employee, and this was just a one-sided thing. A quiet ache I carried around like a secret. A daydream I let myself indulge only in the privacy of my thoughts, where no one could call it foolish. Still, I looked forward to those brief interactions with an intensity that embarrassed me. I would replay his compliments in my head hours after they happened. A simple nice work on that report could carry me through an entire week. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me, really looking, and my stomach would do this ridiculous flip. But then he'd look away, and I'd remind myself that it didn't mean anything. Couldn't. The office itself had its own quiet rhythm, like background noise. People came and went, dragging their chairs across the carpet, microwaving leftovers, gossiping in the break room. There were office birthdays with stale cake and awkward singing, memos no one read, and weekly meetings where Mark somehow managed to make the agenda sound like something worth caring about. That was another thing. He had this way of making even the most mundane things feel like they mattered. Like you mattered. It was disarming, and it made the quiet weight of my feelings harder to ignore. Some days I wished I could switch them off, just flip a switch and go back to being indifferent. It would have been easier, safer, but I couldn't, because no matter how hard I tried, he kept showing up in my thoughts, in my dreams, in the moments when I let my guard down. There was nothing inappropriate between us, nothing that crossed any lines, just tension, unspoken, unacknowledged, but always there, like static in the air before a storm. I told myself it would pass, that eventually the crush would fade, and I'd move on. Maybe transfer departments, maybe find another job. But then, every time I thought seriously about leaving, he'd do something small. Hand me a fresh cup of coffee without asking. Crack a joke that made me laugh even on my worst day. Look at me like he saw me and I'd stay. Because I didn't hate my job. Not as long as Mark was in it. Fridays had a different texture in the office. By 5 o'clock, the place emptied like a tide pulling back from the shore. Desks sat abandoned, chairs askew, computers humming softly to themselves in the silence. Most people couldn't wait to get out. But not me. Not this Friday. And apparently not Mark. We were both still there, holed up in the soft glow of overhead lights while the rest of the building went dark one wing at a time. We were finalizing a quarterly report, one that should have been wrapped days ago but somehow landed in our laps at the last second, like it always did. He was at his desk, blazer gone, sleeves rolled up, reading glasses perched low on his nose. I was across from him, trying to focus, trying not to stare. We didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was companionable, comfortable. The air between us was thick with the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel louder than it should. The scratch of his pen, the soft click of keys, the occasional sigh when one of us ran into another formatting issue. I told myself it was just another work night. But then he smiled at me. One of those tired, crooked grins that made something flutter in my chest, and I knew I was lying to myself. Around 7, he stretched, groaning softly as he arched his back. I looked away too fast, pretending to read a line of data that I'd already looked at 10 times. "I think we're almost there," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Can you pass me that USB? Silver one. Should be on your desk somewhere." I turned, scanning the cluttered mess of my workspace. A couple of silver devices sat among the chaos, one clearly the USB, the other something I probably shouldn't have brought to work. It was a novelty gadget, shaped vaguely like a remote, with a glowing base and a single button in the middle. My friends had given it to me as a gag gift. I kept it on my desk as a joke, a conversation starter. Not that anyone ever noticed it. Until now, my hand hovered over the 2 items. My brain, for reasons I couldn't explain, short-circuited. Maybe it was the way he looked at me. Relaxed, trusting, completely unaware of the potential chaos about to unfold. Maybe it was my own nervousness. Maybe I just panicked. I grabbed the wrong one. "Here you go," I said, crossing the space between us and placing it in his hand. Our fingers brushed, barely, but enough to make me flinch. He looked at me, then down at the device in his palm. "This isn't," he started, trailing off as he turned it over. "What is this thing?" He tilted it in the light, thumb brushing over the glowing button. I opened my mouth to explain, to laugh it off, but the words stuck in my throat. "It's just, something I got online," I mumbled, heat rising to my face. "Kind of a desk toy." Mark raised an eyebrow. "A desk toy?" He didn't sound judgmental, just amused, curious. That somehow made it worse. I reached for it, trying to reclaim the moment. "Sorry, I grabbed the wrong thing. The real USB is." But then he smiled at me. One of those tired, crooked grins that made something flutter in my chest, and I knew I was lying to myself. Around 7, he stretched, groaning softly as he arched his back. I looked away too fast, pretending to read a line of data that I'd already looked at 10 times. "I think we're almost there," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Can you pass me that USB? Silver one. Should be on your desk somewhere." I turned, scanning the cluttered mess of my workspace. A couple of silver devices sat among the chaos, one clearly the USB, the other something I probably shouldn't have brought to work. It was a novelty gadget, shaped vaguely like a remote, with a glowing base and a single button in the middle. My friends had given it to me as a gag gift. I kept it on my desk as a joke, a conversation starter. Not that anyone ever noticed it. Until now, my hand hovered over the 2 items. My brain, for reasons I couldn't explain, short-circuited. Maybe it was the way he looked at me. Relaxed, trusting, completely unaware of the potential chaos about to unfold. Maybe it was my own nervousness. Maybe I just panicked. I grabbed the wrong one. "Here you go," I said, crossing the space between us and placing it in his hand. Our fingers brushed, barely, but enough to make me flinch. He looked at me, then down at the device in his palm. "This isn't," he started, trailing off as he turned it over. "What is this thing?" He tilted it in the light, thumb brushing over the glowing button. I opened my mouth to explain, to laugh it off, but the words stuck in my throat. "It's just, something I got online," I mumbled, heat rising to my face. "Kind of a desk toy." Mark raised an eyebrow. "A desk toy?" He didn't sound judgmental, Just amused, curious. That somehow made it worse. I reached for it, trying to reclaim the moment. Sorry, I grabbed the wrong thing. The real USB is. He didn't hand it back. He was still looking at it, thumb resting lightly on the button. Huh, he said quietly. Looks high-tech. Is it voice-activated or something? No, not at all, I said quickly. Really, it's just for fun. There was a long pause, a silence that pressed in from all sides. He didn't move, just looked at me with this unreadable expression, part amusement, part something I couldn't quite name. His eyes lingered on mine a moment too long. My heart thudded in my chest. Then, without a word, he set the gadget gently on the edge of his desk, picked up the actual USB drive from where it had been hiding beneath a notebook, and gave me a small, knowing smile. Thanks, he said, voice low, almost teasing. I think I've got the right one now. I laughed. Too loud, too fast, and immediately regretted it. Yeah, sorry. Long day. He didn't say anything, just smiled again and turned back to his laptop. But something had shifted. The air felt warmer, closer, like we'd wandered too near a boundary without meaning to and now couldn't quite retreat. I returned to my desk and pretended to focus, but my fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. Across from me, Mark typed steadily, his face calm, his expression unreadable. But every so often, I caught him glancing up at me, brief flickers of attention that made it harder to breathe. Nothing had happened. Not really. But the pause, that charged, quiet pause, hung between us long after the moment passed. And I couldn't help but wonder if he felt it too. The office felt even quieter after that. We both kept working, or at least pretending to. I stared at my screen for a solid 10 minutes without processing a single word. My hands hovered over the keyboard, still and unsure, while my mind replayed every second of that awkward mix-up, over and over like a bad sitcom rerun. I was mortified, not because the device was inappropriate, it technically wasn't, but because it wasn't nothing either. Not when it had come from me. Not when he'd looked at me the way he had. I was so deep in my own spiral I didn't notice him approach until his voice broke the silence. You good? I jumped, physically startled. He was standing at the edge of my cubicle, coffee mug in hand, concern softening the usual sharp lines of his face. His tie was loosened, top button undone. He looked casual, human, somehow more intimidating that way. Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile. Just tired, I guess. He didn't move, just studied me for a second, the kind of pause that felt too focused to be casual. Look, he said, setting his mug down on the divider. You don't have to explain, but if that thing was personal, I didn't mean to, embarrass you. His voice was calm, measured, and warm in a way I hadn't expected. I swallowed hard. It's okay, really. Still, he said, I probably shouldn't have messed with it. I thought it was some kind of futuristic presentation pointer or something. He smiled, eyes twinkling. I half expected it to control the blinds. I let out a nervous laugh. Yeah. Definitely not that advanced. So, desk toy, huh? He said, leaning just slightly against the cubicle wall. His tone was light, but there was a glimmer of amusement behind it. Not mocking, just gently teasing, like he was offering me a way back into safety. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. It was a joke gift from some friends. They thought it was funny. I keep it on my desk for comic relief, I guess. He nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip of his coffee. Well, I've seen worse things on people's desks. One guy at my old firm had a rubber chicken in a business suit. Called it his productivity mascot. I laughed again, this time more genuinely. That actually sounds kind of amazing. It was horrifying, he said, grinning, but weirdly effective. The guy hit every deadline. We stood there in that shared pocket of laughter, the awkwardness lifting like fog in morning sun. He didn't press. He didn't make it weird. Instead, he gave me the one thing I didn't expect. Space. Not physical distance, but emotional breathing room, like he'd opened a window and let fresh air into the room. That moment earlier, I began, unsure why I was still talking. Thanks for not making it a thing. He tilted his head. It doesn't have to be. But it was a little weird, I added quickly, trying to lighten the mood. Even I can admit that. He shrugged. We all have things we keep to ourselves. Doesn't make them bad. Just personal. There was something in the way he said it, soft, like he wasn't just talking about me anymore. His gaze lingered on me for a second longer than necessary, and my stomach did that stupid twist again. It's funny, he added, looking down at his coffee. I've worked in a lot of places, but this is the first time a USB drive turned into a therapy session. I snorted. Guess that makes us trendsetters. He laughed, and it was real. That low, warm sound that always made me feel like the world wasn't quite so heavy. You're all right, you know that? He said. I looked up at him, startled. What? You? He said again, gentler this time. You're all right. Smart. Good under pressure. Easy to talk to. My cheeks burned. I wanted to deflect, make a joke, pretend like it didn't mean much, but I couldn't. Thanks, I said instead, quieter than I intended. He nodded and straightened, picking up his mug. All right, let's finish this report so we can both pretend we're not spending our Friday night at the office. Deal. He gave me one last look, something between a smile and a thought he hadn't said out loud, and walked back to his desk. And even though we didn't speak for the rest of the evening, the silence had changed again. It wasn't stiff or awkward. It was full, like a conversation that had paused, not ended. Something unspoken had passed between us. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted it to stay that way. The report was done. Well, mostly. Just some formatting tweaks and one last review. But the hard part, the soul-sucking data entry and finicky formulas, was finished. I sat back in my chair, stretching my arms overhead with a groan, eyes flicking toward the wall clock. Almost 9 p.m. Mark stood from his desk and gave a satisfied sigh. We survived. Barely? I muttered, rubbing my eyes. We should get medals. He chuckled. Or at least better coffee. He motioned toward the break room with a tilt of his head. You in? I think the vending machine's still stocked with barely tolerable sludge. I hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Sure. The break room was a dull gray box with flickering fluorescent lights and the faint hum of an overworked mini-fridge. The coffee machine hissed to life as Mark pressed a few buttons, then handed me a paper cup that was too hot to hold and smelled vaguely of burnt hopes. We sat across from each other at the little plastic table in the corner. The room felt strangely separate from the rest of the office, like a neutral zone where titles didn't matter as much. For a while, we just sipped in silence. Then Mark spoke. You ever feel like you blink and realize you haven't made a real connection in months? The question came out of nowhere. No warning. Just dropped into the space between us like a coin tossed into a deep well. I blinked. Sometimes. He stared into his coffee. It's weird, isn't it? You can spend your entire day surrounded by people, talking nonstop, but still feel not really seen. There was a weight behind his words. Not heavy, exactly, but worn. Familiar. Like he'd been carrying it a long time. I guess being the boss doesn't help, I offered gently. A corner of his mouth twitched. It doesn't. People see the title, not the person. They filter everything through it. Even small talk feels rehearsed. He paused, glancing up at me. That's why I appreciate you. I blinked. Me? You don't put on a performance. You're real, which is rare, especially here. My stomach flipped. I didn't know what to say, so I looked down at my cup. The rim was already softening from the heat. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. Sorry. Didn't mean to dump that on you. No, it's fine, I said quickly. Really, I get it. There was a beat of silence. I've always admired you, I said before I could stop myself. My voice cracked slightly on the last word. He looked at me, something unreadable flickering across his face. I continued, fumbling. Just the way you carry yourself. You're confident but not arrogant. Fair. Thoughtful. And you make people feel like they matter, even if you're swamped. I trailed off, staring into the dark swirl of my coffee, instantly regretting how honest I'd been. Mark didn't respond right away. When I glanced up, he was still watching me. Not with judgment, but with something quieter, something softer. "Thank you," he said, voice low. "That means more than you know." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, like the air between us had been charged with something unspoken, humming gently in the background. I don't know how long we sat like that, cups in hand, eyes occasionally meeting then drifting away again. I wanted to say more, to tell him what I really felt. How many times I'd caught myself looking for him in a crowded room. How many nights I'd stayed late just hoping to share the same air a little longer. But I couldn't. I wasn't sure if it was fear or common sense holding me back. Maybe both. Mark set his cup down slowly. His fingers brushed the edge of the table, then reached forward. Not grabbing, not forcing, just reaching. His hand hovered near mine, open and still, an invitation. "You're safe with me," he said quietly. Something in me broke and stitched itself back together at the same time. I looked down at our hands, not touching, not yet, but close enough to feel the warmth between them. The words lodged in my throat were too fragile, too honest, so I didn't speak. Instead, I shifted just enough to let my pinky rest against his. He didn't move away. Neither did I. Something changed after that night. It wasn't obvious. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic confession. But the shift was real, quiet and steady. Like the way light changes in a room before anyone notices the sun has set. We still acted like co-workers, still passed each other reports, sat in meetings, exchanged updates like everything was normal. But in the spaces between the usual, that's where the change lived. In the way he lingered by my desk just a few seconds longer than necessary. In the way his hand would brush mine when we passed each other documents. In the way he smiled when he said my name. Not polite, not distant, but personal, like a small gift he wasn't sure I'd notice. I noticed. We started having lunch together more often. Sometimes in the break room, sometimes outside if the weather was nice. We didn't talk about anything earth-shattering, mostly silly things. Favorite snacks from childhood. Shows we swore we'd watch but never got around to. The worst dates we'd ever been on, his involved an allergic reaction and a very public sneeze fit in an art gallery. Mine involved a guy who thought tipping was a scam invented by waiters. The way he laughed at my stories made something twist warmly in my chest. There was a softness to him I hadn't seen before. I'd always respected his professionalism, his calm control, but now I was seeing something more vulnerable underneath it. A man who carried things quietly, who had gotten used to keeping pieces of himself tucked away. I started to understand that maybe he wasn't just being kind that night in the break room. Maybe he saw me, too. One late afternoon, we ended up walking to a cafe a few blocks from the office after a long client call. It was just the two of us, no pretense, no excuse. He held the door open for me, waited until I sat down before ordering. We both got tea. He liked his with honey. I took mine black. We sat by the window, watching people pass with their umbrellas tucked under their arms. City noise muted by glass. At some point I asked, "Did you always want to do this? Be in charge of people?" He chuckled. "No. Not really. I kind of fell into it. One promotion led to another, and then suddenly everyone was calling me sir, and looking to me for answers I wasn't always sure I had." I smiled. "You hide that well." He looked at me, eyes steady. "Only because I've had to." There was a pause. The soft clink of spoons in nearby mugs. Steam curled up from his cup, catching the light. "It's hard," he said after a moment, "to let people in when you're used to being the one holding things together. Makes you feel like you don't get to break. Like being human is off limits." I didn't know what to say, but I wanted to reach across the table and touch his hand. I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I said quietly, "You don't have to do that with me." He looked down, smiled. "I know," he said. The next few days at work passed in a blur of meetings and catch-up tasks. But the silence between us felt more alive than ever, like a story half-told, waiting for someone to turn the page. Then came Friday. Most of the office had cleared out by 5, eager for weekend plans and fresh air. I stayed behind to finish some documentation, and so did he. We weren't even pretending it was a coincidence anymore. He wandered over to my desk around 6, holding 2 coffees. No words, just a smile and a quiet offering. I took mine gratefully. We sipped in silence for a while, the city lights starting to bloom against the windows. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course." "That night," he began, voice low, "when you told me you admired me, were you just being kind?" I looked at him, really looked, and saw something open in his expression. Not fear exactly, but hope holding its breath. "No," I said. "I meant it." He exhaled. "Just that." But it felt like the whole room shifted with it. "I'm glad," he said, "because I've admired you too. For a long time. I just wasn't sure I was allowed to." My heart thudded so hard I felt it in my throat. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. He stepped closer. Not dramatically, just enough to blur the line of personal space. His hand came up, slow and careful, and rested on my shoulder. His thumb traced a slow, thoughtful line over the fabric of my shirt. "You've been brave," he said softly. "More than I've ever been." His hand lingered, warm, steady. I didn't move. I didn't want to. And in that quiet moment, with the office empty and the world hushed around us, I realized this wasn't something I had made up. I hadn't been reading too much into things or mistaking kindness for connection. He was here. So was I. And something between us had just stepped out of the shadows and into the light. It was almost poetic how often we found ourselves staying late these days. On paper, it was about wrapping up client deliverables or clearing the decks before the next cycle started. But we both knew better. It wasn't about the work anymore. It was about us. The office was quiet again. That same Friday hush, like the world had wound down and forgotten we were still here. Lights were dimmed in most of the building, but the glow from our desks cast soft halos over the carpet. The air had that faint, recycled chill of after-hour silence. I was halfway through proofreading a contract when Mark walked over with a USB drive in hand. He dangled it between 2 fingers like he was offering a piece of candy. "Thought I'd be the one making mistakes tonight," he said with a crooked grin. I blinked, confused for a second, then I saw it. The drive was silver, just like the one I'd accidentally handed him weeks ago. I burst out laughing, my head falling back against the chair. "Oh my God! You didn't." He leaned a hip against my desk. I couldn't resist. "I saw it on your desk and thought, well, poetic justice, right?" I took the drive from him, fingers brushing his just slightly. "I'm not sure I've ever recovered from that moment." "You recovered fine," he said, smiling. I, on the other hand, had to go home and Google what the hell it was. I groaned and buried my face in my hands. "You didn't." "Oh, I did," he said, clearly enjoying himself. "I learned more than I wanted to." Despite my embarrassment, I laughed. Real and unguarded. He always knew exactly how to make things feel lighter, softer, like the weight of my own self-consciousness didn't have to be so heavy. When the laughter settled, the quiet came back. But this time it felt different, comfortable. Mark glanced toward the windows, where city lights blinked in the distance like tiny, flickering promises. "Do you ever think about," he started, then paused. "If things were different?" The question landed softly, but it echoed in me like a bell. I looked at him. He wasn't smiling anymore, not in the teasing way. His eyes were steady, careful. "Different how?" I asked gently. He gave a half shrug. "If we weren't working together. If I wasn't your manager. If we'd met somewhere else." I considered the question for a moment. It wasn't hypothetical. Not really. It was a quiet door opening, and he was waiting to see if I'd walk through. "Sometimes," I said. "Yeah, I think about it." He nodded, but didn't speak. "I think about what it would be like," I continued, choosing my words slowly, "if I didn't have to pretend you were just another boss. If I could say what I actually felt without wondering if it would ruin everything." Mark's eyes didn't leave mine. The silence stretched between us. Not tense, but full. Like something sacred had been placed between us and neither of us wanted to move too quickly. "What do you feel?" he asked, his voice low. I looked down at the USB in my hand, rolled it between my fingers, then back up. I like you, I said. Not just as a boss. Not just as a person. I look forward to seeing you every day. I carry things you say around in my head for longer than I should. And sometimes I stay late just because I know you will. My throat felt tight, but I kept going. I know there are rules. I know what's at stake. But I also know when something's real. And this feels real. He let out a breath like he'd been holding it for hours. Then, after a long, quiet moment, he said, maybe we don't need to pretend anymore. I felt something shift again, deeper this time. Not just a spark, but a settling. Like the truth had finally landed and found a place to rest. Neither of us made a move. We didn't need to. We just sat there, close but not touching, letting the words linger in the space between us like fragile glass catching light. I didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know what it would look like tomorrow or the next week, or whether the rules would come crashing down around us. But in that moment, in the soft hush of an empty office with the glow of city lights behind us, I knew one thing for certain. We weren't pretending anymore.